I'm the president and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We're excited to have you all here today for informal dialogue and debate on three forces shaping the US economy. Climate change, artificial intelligence, and labor inequities challenge both workers and government alike. These forces are persistent and widespread across the economy, and addressing them will require structural change. We're excited to hear from a great panel of experts to dive into the evidence on these issues and explore the steps that Congress and the Biden administration can take so that we can meet this moment head on and deliver strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Adrian Ma, the host and reporter for NPR's The Indicator from Planet Money. Take it away, Adrian.
Test, test, test. This is me saying words. Okay, it works. Hello. Thank you, everybody, for coming out, for enjoying the snacks and the booze. Feel free to clap, get rowdy. The rowdier, the better. My name is Adrian Ma, and we are the Research on Tap singers. Tonight we'll be performing. No. I'm here to introduce our panelists, who are three very amazing researchers whose work you probably already know. But just to dispose of the formalities, we'll start by introducing Molly Kinder, who's a fellow at Brookings Metro, where she examines the impact of generative AI on work and workers. Molly's also a nationally recognized expert on labor policy, economic inequality, low-wage work, and the future of work. Everybody, clap it up. Thank you. Adia Harvey Wingfield. Adia is a professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research examines how and why racial and gender inequality persist in professional occupations. She's also author of the book Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It. Clap it up, please. And please clap. No. Finally, last but not least, Ji-Sung Park is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. As an environmental and labor economist, his research focuses on the environmental factors that shape economic opportunity. And he's also author of the book Slow Burn: The Hidden Costs of a Warming World. Please give him a hand. And to start off, I think I want to get like a quick economic vibe check, which is to say, I want to ask each of you what you think is most notable about the economic moment that we're in right now. For example, like if you were to ask me what's most notable about the economic moment we're in, I would say it would have to be the fact that, like, from a bird's eye view, our economy seems to be doing pretty well. Unemployment is near historic lows, and wages have been going up, and consumers are spending, and yet a lot of people don't feel good. They feel pinched by inflation and high interest rates, and so there's this weird dissonance right now between like the headline numbers and how people are feeling, and I think that is what really kind of I find notable about this economic moment. But let's do a round robin, just like in a minute or so. What stands out to you? Molly?
What stands out to me was my microphone was off. I feel like we have this interesting moment for labor and for unions. On the one hand, it feels like it's a big moment for labor. We've seen some really big wins, from the auto workers to Hollywood writers, lots of strikes, lots of activities. The union favorability rating is its, I think, highest ever. But there's also a lot of setbacks. So we just saw a big win in the South at a Volkswagen plant, and then right after that, two big losses in Alabama. So the Starbucks workers, it was a huge deal, and they still haven't gotten a contract. So I think we're in sort of fits and starts. It's like a big moment for labor, but I think because of how labor laws are so tipped against unions and workers, it's also a hard moment as well.
Adia, what about you? What's notable about this moment?
Yeah, well, this is why you don't want to go second, because I was
Sorry.
No, you're fine. No, I was actually thinking a lot, though, about the changes that are happening in the labor movement and how we're seeing more support for labor activism and rising labor activism, as Molly said, but also seeing this happen in fits and starts. But coupled with that, and here I'll step on your toes a little bit, one of the things that I think is really interesting and curious is how we are seeing technological advances happen and what that's going to mean for what work looks like going forward. Molly and I were talking about this before we got started. There's just so much rapid advancement and so little clarity about what it all is that going to actually mean. And I think it's really interesting to think about where work is going, given that we are seeing such forward motion with technology and AI and other aspects of how technology is changing, but we're not necessarily seeing that flanked by also thinking through what our work and workplaces are going to look like, even as we're seeing the technological advances happen.
Yeah, the policy isn't caught up to the practice yet.
Not even close.
Ji-sung, what about you?
Well, yeah, what happens when you go third? Actually, I'd like to echo everything you've said so far, is particularly the sense of weird dissonance, right, between the so-called economic fundamental indicators and the sense of the visceral, lived sense of what our moment is like for everyday individuals. As someone who thinks a lot about climate policy, though, I will say what's really notable to me is that we're in a moment where we're sort of feeling the pinch of climate change more and more in a present tense, as a present tense phenomenon, while at the same time it sort of flew under the radar, and we'll talk about this later, but at least in the US, we're sort of in the wake of what was the largest win in terms of federal climate policy maybe ever. And so we're at this moment of
Talking about the Inflation Reduction Act?
Inflation Reduction Act, correct. And we're at this moment of sort of wind in our sails in terms of long-run progress, obviously a lot more work to be done, while also beginning to grapple with the day-to-day reality of climate change that is already at our doorstep. Yeah.
Okay, economic vibes checked. Let us commence the deep nerding out by talking about research. We are going to turn to talking about research on the three topics of tonight, which are going to be big in 2024. They are climate change, workplace inequity, and artificial intelligence. Ji-sung, we'll start with you. Your research has explored the impact of rising temperatures on workers. And just as like a little nugget of your research, you looked at data on workers just in California, just in 2021, and you estimated that just in that 1 year, at least 15,000 workers suffered from heat-related illness or injury. And that, I think, is like the visceral effect that we can all understand about climate change and warming temperatures. But there's also economic effects too, right? Can you talk about those?
Absolutely, and since we are nerding out, I will just say that research actually showed that it was for the period 2000 to 2019, on average, we saw every year roughly 15,000 injuries that were influenced by hotter temperature. But I think the broader point that I think is worth making now is first that just to underscore the rapidity of the warming that is already happening, I find it a little bit difficult to think about 1.5 degrees Celsius, 1.8 degrees Celsius, what does that mean? Maybe a more experientially anchored alternative is the increase in the frequency of hot days. So you could draw a threshold at, say, 90-degree days. And by that measure, a place like Atlanta, for instance, is expected to experience 50 additional days per year above 90 degrees within the next few decades. And that's actually irrespective of what we're able to do in terms of climate mitigation. So with that as sort of one piece of motivation, my co-authors, my colleagues and I have been interested in what does that mean for workers, especially given the fact that, again, climate change is occurring in a moment where we've seen sort of significant rise in inequality in the workplace, or persistent gaps in sort of economic wherewithal, especially between those with and without access to the skills that are highly rewarded in the modern workplace. And so, yeah, in our research, we find that particularly for non-BA workers, so workers in construction, manufacturing, warehousing, et cetera, even the simple act of going to work on a hot day significantly increases your risk of serious injury. And I think one last piece I'll say here is what we were a little bit surprised by is a subtle aspect of it, which is the vast majority of the increase in risk is actually not from heat illnesses that are diagnosed by medical professionals as being caused by heat, but things that are ostensibly unrelated to heat. So someone falling off of a ladder, someone getting hit by a moving vehicle. These sort of other unrelated accidents appear to increase subtly on hotter days, but because it's spread out across such a wide swath of the economy, the cumulative effects, getting back to that number you were referring to earlier, seem to be important.
So I'm curious, like, as an economist, how does your background as an economist inform how you think we ought to address this problem?
Yeah, great question. As I was joking with you before, I had the privilege and luck of being educated in economics post so-called credibility revolution, but also post, I won't say climate denial, but after we as a community of economists really began to apply the tools of post-credibility revolution causal inference to the issue of climate change. And so
In credibility revolution, that was basically, if I put it in simple terms, a revolution in like being able to say with more certainty that the data is showing us that this thing caused this other thing.
correct. Disentangling cause and effect in settings where you're not able to run randomized controlled trials, essentially. That's relevant for the work that I do and the way I think about climate change, in part because I'm really interested in, and I think it's important to understand, the so-called microeconomic implications of climate change, particularly how the effects of any given climate hazard, whether it's heat, wildfire, smoke, flooding, how they vary across the income and skills distribution across different kinds of workers and industries. So that's sort of my approach to thinking about climate change.
Okay, thank you very much. Adia, next question's for you. So your research looks at how racial inequality persists in the workplace, even though we have laws against discrimination, we have companies, especially in the last few years, coming out and making all kinds of DEI pledges, and yet racial inequality and discrimination still persists because of something you call gray areas. So can you explain what are gray areas?
Sure. So when I talk about gray areas in the book, this is my way of trying to identify this paradox that you just described, right? Why do we still see that we have workplaces where workers are more likely to say that they want DEI policies? We have a Civil Rights Act that passed 60 years ago, but we still see that black workers experience wage gaps. They're less likely to move into leadership and middle management level roles. They are more likely to stall out and find that they're being pushed out of companies, particularly as they are trying to advance. So what I argue in the book is that these processes occur not because people are necessarily behaving in explicitly discriminatory fashion, which is now illegal if you're being explicit about it, but more so that aspects of how we work are what are contributing to racial inequality. So, for example, my job as a college professor requires that I do research, teaching, and service. Sometimes it requires more service than I think I should be doing. But essentially, those are the things that are spelled out in my contract, and that's what my job is. But what my job doesn't specify is that if I want to be eligible for fellowships or for opportunities, I need people to write me letters of recommendation. If I want to move up in the career ladder, I need a mentor or a sponsor who's going to be able to vouch for me and to put in a good word for me. If I want to make sure that I'm vibing with my colleagues, I have to make sure I understand the organizational culture of my workplace and that I'm not doing anything that is anathema to it. But these are never things that are specified in our job contracts, but they are always a part of the job that we have to do. And those are the gray areas, the social, the cultural, the relational parts of work, the areas that are unregulated, the areas that are often undefined, and the areas that, because they are very much driven by our social interactions, are the areas where it's easy for racial inequality to perpetuate.
So if the existence of this gray area, of these gray areas allow discrimination, inequality, and inequity to persist, how does that persistence affect the economy more broadly?
Right, so one of the things that I found from gray areas is that this has real impacts for how black workers move through organizations and where they do or don't ascend to leadership roles. One of the stories that I describe in the book is one of Brian, who's a film producer. And he talks about being hired into the studio job after the Oscars So White controversy, where there was a lot of pressure on studios to try to diversify. So he gets hired by the studio and they say, you know, we really want to start telling different stories. We want to make sure that we're reaching a broad array of different voices and different markets and so forth. And we really want to double down on our commitment to you to make sure that you're the person who's bringing that in. And so Brian says, great, this is what I want to be doing. This is fantastic. But what he finds is that when he's bringing his supervisors these stories about the diversity and breadth of Black life, what they often rely on is this tried and true mantra that these aren't films that are going to sell. These are not films that make money, even though there's empirical evidence to show otherwise. So Brian stayed in the job for a while. He got frustrated when he kept kind of banging his head against the wall and ultimately decided to leave that company to go to a different one that incidentally was a Black-owned production company where he thought that his work could have more value. And I share Brian's story because it's an example of what I think is the type of turnover and the climate and the organizational space that many Black workers experience in a lot of our workplaces. When we do have these organizations where gray areas are present and these social, cultural, and relational parts of work are areas that often go unchecked and unacknowledged, and areas where racial inequality can persist, we see a lot of burnout, we see a lot of turnover, we see a lot of Black workers who end up not being able to contribute to organizations and not being able to contribute to the broader economy in the way that they otherwise would have. There's data from the Federal Reserve of San Francisco that showed that racial and gender inequality wastes about $5 trillion a year in the United States. And so when we think about the types of stories that I show in gray areas, these give a real hands-on view, or bird's eye view, whatever metaphor you want to use, but they give us some insights into how that process occurs, that we end up wasting so much money and damaging our economy through these processes of racial inequality at work.
And you're going to we'll talk a little bit later about some of the things you think can be done about that.
Yes.
Before we get to that, Molly, your work looks at the disruptive nature of artificial intelligence on the American workforce, and you've been looking at this way before we've even been talking about AI as we all know it now, where you like type in a few words and it like paints you a Picasso or writes you a screenplay or whatever. You've been looking at AI for a while, and can actually, you said like there are already ways that AI has affected the workforce before generative AI. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So to answer that question, I want to put us back to the year 2019, so pre-pandemic, and I'm imagining we were having an event, and I'm an expert talking about AI and the workforce, and you asked me that question. Molly, what are you worried about with AI and the workforce? I would probably say two main points, and they would both be wrong today. So the first thing that was a very common thing that was said a lot about the concerns, this is pre-generative AI, this is the area where we talked about the future of work, was first that we were really concerned that AI was going to have a disproportionate impact on women, low-wage workers, and workers of color. And we were worried about the quantity of jobs, in jobs like cashiers and fast food workers, warehouse workers, Uber drivers, long-haul truck drivers. These were some of the types of occupations that we were really worried about with in terms of quantity of jobs. And the second thing that would have been a typical thing that an expert would have said is that the way to stay ahead of this technology is to lean in and be more human, be more creative, be more strategic, get more education, be more cognitive, be less like a machine. So there's two big reasons why that we would look back at that and we think that's wrong. First is that we don't actually see in the real world that there's been a huge loss of these jobs. In fact, in the pandemic, we saw a labor shortage in these occupations. And in fact, some of these have the fastest growing wage gains because we've had a shortage of workers in them. So quantity of jobs was actually not the real concern for AI. It turns out it was the quality of jobs. So the real thing that we've seen with the evidence of the impact of AI on some of these lower paid jobs is the quality of those jobs. So things like surveillance and algorithmic management and bias, even quickening up the pace of some of this work in warehouses. So really the story that there was a concern about was quality or quantity. It turned out that the issue was quality. And as I can reflect more on, today, the generative AI technologies are really upending everything I just said, which was the sort of consensus about how we stay ahead of technology.
And you just put it in sort of blunter terms when I was asking about it. You were like, we got it so wrong.
We got it really wrong. I'm not going to lie. We got it really wrong.
Okay, so the technology change has caught us a little bit flat-footed. What about generative AI now? We've gone from, like you were saying, like management algorithms and stuff like that to the technology that just like is blowing people's mind on a weekly basis. How do you see that affecting the workforce going forward?
Yeah, so I think I would separate that out. The long-term future, I think part of the reason why we're all so taken by generative AI is it's so surprising. It feels like it's moving really fast. It feels like every week there's some new video or voice, Scarlett Johansson suddenly talking. It's sort of, we're really blown away by it, and there's something about the speed of it and the surprising nature and things we never thought technology can do. So I think there's a lot of fear, frankly, and I think when people project out into the future, we imagine this could get incredibly powerful and be very disruptive. I'm not really going to reflect on that dystopian future because there's also a lot of reasons why that might not happen, whether it's the cost, the compute power needed, energy needs. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why this might not end up being in this world where there's no work. But even in the near term with the technology, just ChatGPT-4, the technology we have, it can be very disruptive. I think what we're seeing, some very high-level insights, is that the workers who are most exposed to this technology doesn't mean their jobs are going away. It just means that their occupations will likely be able to engage with this technology. It's more likely workers with a BA. So unlike these past technologies, which really were so concentrated in sort of lower-paid jobs, the two groups that I would really focus on is workers with a BA, not as much graduate degrees, and women in clerical roles and sort of lower middle class jobs. So think customer service, HR assistants, bookkeeping assistants, legal secretaries. That's like a really high risk of automation. But then there's a lot of jobs that require a BA. Some of the industries that are most exposed, again, doesn't mean those jobs are all going away, but they're where we probably will see the greatest change are sectors like law and finance, STEM jobs, creative industries. Healthcare is going to change quite a lot. Academia, we'll have to ask our friends here. So there's going to be a lot of disruption. I think we have some access to some data from OpenAI that looks at every job across the economy and all the tasks that comprise them, and what's the AI exposure and the automation risk. I think the headline is for the foreseeable future. The takeaway is that most people are going to be augmented. This is actually just going to be a very helpful tool. This shouldn't be something that scares people in the near term, but there is going to be some pain, and there definitely are occupations that we're already seeing some impacts, some job changes. I would say the ones that we're seeing fastest, customer service, there's already a lot of evidence that's changing really fast. IT help desks, there's a lot of emphasis on marketing jobs that are really changing, a lot of creative jobs, journalism. So yes, exactly. Right, all of us here, we're all in this boat. Research. So it's a technology moving really fast, and I would just echo, we're not prepared as a country, we're not prepared with policy, and in order to make sure that this is a technology that's going to be good for workers, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, this is a true story. Earlier today, so my oven broke, and the guy who came to fix it was a very young guy who fixes appliances, but he was like, I'm going to school to learn computer science, and then I'm going to focus on trying to get into AI. And I was like, oh, interesting. And he's like, because it's better to work with the future than work against it. And I was like, okay, maybe he's ahead of the curve. Before we move on, I think we've outlined some problems. We've outlined how you've researched these problems. Just very quickly, what's a gap in the research that you feel like that we need to dig more in that direction? Jisa.
Wow. Too many gaps in the researcher's mind, obviously. Let me just focus on one. I mean, to my earlier point about climate change as a present tense phenomenon, I think we are ill-equipped in terms of the intellectual infrastructure that is necessary to engage in the adaptation that we need to do. So, right, stating the obvious, there's climate mitigation, which is reducing CO2 emissions so that we can rein in warming over the long haul. But then there's adaptation, right, the actions that we take to protect our economies from the adverse consequences of climate change that's already happening. I think in terms of the adaptation space, there's a recognition of the need, but not much yet in terms of precision around what kinds of interventions and tools are most effective for whom. And I think that's, imagine that you knew ahead of time that COVID was going to happen over and over and over, but just in small doses. You would want to prepare for that and adapt in advance. We had to sort of adapt on the fly, right? That's how I think about climate adaptation. We have the opportunity to get ahead of that curve because we kind of can project with a lot of clarity what the curve looks like. But at the moment, I think there are more questions than answers there.
Idea?
Yeah, one of the things that I think about a lot, again, goes back to this question of technology and what it's going to mean for black workers who are, or workers of color, but black workers specifically, who are in these professional white-collar jobs, right? I know when we saw the pandemic happening, there was a lot of discussion about people working remotely and professionals being able to work remotely and how that widened these gaps between people who were essential workers and didn't have that luxury. And thinking about the implications of this for racial inequality, one of the things that I heard a lot was black professionals saying, I really enjoy the opportunity to work remotely because I'm away from my colleagues who are hassling me, and I can just be at home, and I can.
I heard this many times.
Right,
yeah.
I can get stuff done. I can just focus on my job, and this is just a better way. But I also know, and we also know as sociologists and people who study work, that again, so much of work is social, right? So what happens when you have black workers who are not kind of in the office, able to interact with people, who are not able to form the networks and connections that they need because they are working remotely? Do they still have the opportunities to climb the corporate ladder because their work just speaks for itself? That has not been what the data suggests, right? But are they also in a position where working remotely may offer some psychosocial or psychological benefits by virtue of not having to be in spaces that they experience as very hostile, but still creates new opportunities for obstacles to be present because they aren't able to navigate these gray areas and they aren't able to form the types of social relationships that they need in order to really be part of the integrative glue of these environments and benefit from the types of connections and networks that facilitate upward mobility? I don't think we really know yet. I have some hypotheses, but
I would be very interested to know,
Yeah.
to see what the results of that, because I have thought a lot about like people who are younger that I work with who are just starting like their first jobs out of college, like not being in the office with other people, being around.
Yeah.
It's just such a different.
Yeah.
How does that affect your learning and your advancement?
right.
What about you, Molly? What's a gap in the research you're like, let's poke on that some more?
I mean, there's a ton. So if anyone's interested in AI, there's a lot of questions that we need answered. I would say the first is this is such a new technology. We still don't know exactly what's happening in specific sectors and specific workplaces. So I think we need a lot more grounded research. There's a big question mark about whether this is going to be a technology that combats inequality or exacerbates inequality. And right now, there's a little bit of academic literature emerging to suggest that the biggest benefits of using this technology in simulated experiments in different workplaces are the least experienced and lowest performing workers. So there's been a lot of hope that that might mean that this is something that's going to really combat inequality. I'm seeing the opposite when I talk to folks in the real world in different sectors, that it's actually inexperienced workers coming out of college that might be the most exposed. So I think there's just a lot we need to disentangle about even the directional. Is this providing a boost to workers, or is it actually de-skilling? Like, there's some basic questions that we just really don't know. So I would invite anybody interested in this topic. We really need some more concrete research about what's actually happening in the workplace.
De-skilling isn't like, okay, is this helping people work better, or is it actually making them less skilled?
Right, so this example, there's these really interesting experiments in a call center, in a fancy consulting firm, in simulated work settings, and they find that when workers who are very inexperienced can use ChatGPT, the quality of their work goes up and their performance improves. So on the one hand, you think that's upskilling, but actually if it turns out they're just copying and pasting from ChatGPT, that might be de-skilling the job because anyone without skill can do it. So it's actually less valuable in a way. So are we talking about, is this an upskilling? Are you using this like a coach and you're adding your own ingenuity to it? Or literally is the machine doing it in a way that you're actually de-skilling the job? And that's something we just, honestly, with the different studies, we haven't disentangled that, and that's a major, major distinction.
Yeah, if I could just jump in and add an anecdata point to your mill.
I love some anecdata. Go ahead.
We have faculty meetings about this quite regularly. Arguably one of the jobs of higher education is to upskill or create skills. And there's still so many unanswered questions. I'd be curious what it's like at your university too, around to what extent should we encourage or discourage students from using AI? I mean, we know they're using it. I personally do worry about the de-skilling aspect because some of these essays look too, well, they feel like ChatGPT. I can't quite put my finger on why. And so they read really nicely and with a little bit of pizzazz, but I'm a little worried that if that's getting in the way of forming the human capital base necessary to learn how to write and rigorously, interrogate questions. Anecdata point, but yeah, need for research.
ChatGPT should start writing like not written by a robot. Okay, so we've talked a lot about we've outlined the problems, but there is some hope to be had here. There are potential solutions that you've each spent a lot of time thinking about. So let's go into some of those, starting with Adia. We'll start with you this time. So in your book, you talk about how people inside companies can try and address gray areas. But also, what about policymakers at, say, like the federal level? What can they do about gray areas?
Yeah, one of the things that my editor made me put in the book was to put in information about recommended solutions so that I would not be your typical negative sociologist bumming everybody out with all the bad news. But I will say that I think that a lot of the things that we know work to improve workplaces writ large can really have a lot of implications for addressing some of these inequities that I find among black workers, right? So in general, if we're speaking very broadly, we know that in many cases, workers have a lot of uncertainty and a lot of insecurity, like Molly was talking about at the onset, right? This can range from non-compete clauses to not being able to have advanced scheduling to, if we're talking about professional workplaces, just this pressure for overwork and what we refer to as these greedy occupations where people are working constantly. These are all things that don't have to be central features of our workplaces, right? We can, in California, for example, there's legislation now that's being considered to require employers to respect when workers detach for the day and when they unplug and when they aren't actually available. You look as if this seems like a novel phenomenon, and that.
Yeah, no, I just like California always like feel like they're the first ones to get out there.
Right.
Like, let's try that.
Right. But again, that's the idea that this would be a novel phenomenon is part of the point. That we, particularly for people who are in professional jobs, there has been this creeping encroachment on personal time, on time away from work, where the expectation is that people just work more, and you're consistently available. That has implications in many cases for black workers who already, in many cases, labor under the expectation that they are not competent, that they are not qualified, and that they have to do more to show that they meet the baseline expectations for their jobs. So when we think about things that could happen from a policy level, it can be things as basic as discouraging or forbidding this type of overreach, of making sure that people have access to scheduling in advance. Some places are considering 4-day work weeks, which early trials are showing have real positive implications for workers feeling more rested, more productive, more attached to and favorably about their jobs. So these are things that do not necessarily tie explicitly back to racial inequality, but create better and more productive and healthier workplaces for all. And I think these are directions that we want to really think about going in when we think about what our workplaces can look like. And then the last point that I'll just make, because it just bugs me consistently that we don't have this in the United States, would be that it would just be really nice to have paid vacation and sick leave. And not just because it's just such a basic, and not just because it would be nice, but because this is how advanced civilized democracies behave and treat their workers. And I think it's really past time for us to take a step in this direction for all of the obvious benefits that the rest of the world gets to enjoy.
I love hearing about, so these are sort of like systemic tweaks that can get at the problem. Do you have what are some things that like individuals might do inside their workplace?
Yes, so if we're talking about individuals, there are actually a lot of opportunities to think about ways to identify and try to redress these gray areas that are present. If we were talking about, one of the things that I cover in the book has to do with how people find access to jobs in the first place. And so much of that is driven by our social networks and our connections. So when it comes to hiring, people can make sure that they are broadening their pool of people that they refer and making sure that they are making it a point to broaden their networks and refer people in a diverse fashion. So make sure that you are able to diversify the recruitment networks that you mentioned. When it comes to organizational culture, another area that I talk about in the book, it can be really critical for people who are just everyday workers in workplaces to be allies in the sense of speaking up in support of offering support for diversity policies that actually work, steering away from mandated diversity trainings, which anybody in my field will tell you actually does not work and does not achieve the ends that it is supposed to. When it comes to advancement and moving ahead, people can serve as sponsors, people can serve as mentors, but a lot of it has to do with identifying areas where workers of color and black workers specifically are often overlooked and making sure that there is an intentional, deliberate push to make sure that they are included in these informal parts of our workplaces rather than excluded.
Okay, thank you very much. Molly, let's keep talking solutions. So I think it's fair to say most of the conversation right now about how AI is affecting the workforce is like how it's going to do it in a bad way, like how it's going to like Is it going to displace people from their jobs? Is it going to perpetuate bias or discrimination? But does AI have the potential to have some positive impacts for workers and the workforce, and how might policymakers try and kind of push us in that direction?
Yes, no question. I use generative AI all the time. I think there's huge potentials. If you think about our country, we are facing some big challenges. We've had very low productivity growth for a long time. We have a demographic cliff coming up where we have a very aging population. And we have a lot of jobs that are just frankly not good jobs and a lot of inequality. So can generative AI, if under the right circumstances, the right policies, the right choices, the right voice for workers, can it actually be part of the solution? And I think the answer is, in theory, yes. I think there's a lot to this technology that's positive if done in the right way. So just to give a little bit of a flavor of what excites me, imagine a home health worker. This is one of my projects is on how to improve the quality of home care jobs. A lot of home care workers are immigrants, and they're not speaking the same language natively as a lot of the people that they are caring for. I don't know if anyone watched the most recent demo from ChatGPT. This language translation instantaneously is remarkable. Imagine the superpower on the phone of a home care worker, that she can look up all sorts of information. Maybe she can even upskill the job, be able to get more, take a picture of something and help diagnose something, be more in touch with the clinical staff. Lots of opportunities there. There's a lot of indications that generative AI is hugely helpful if you're starting a business. It can rapidly sort of complement your skill set, overcome your weaknesses. For high-paying jobs, I've talked to lots of workers in fields as diverse as market research to insurance underwriting, where people see huge benefits. Architecture is another one. Huge opportunities to take away the worst parts of your job, some of the drudgery, and move into the better parts of your job. So I think there's a lot of upside and potential. The challenge is that the way we're moving as a country is not necessarily in that direction. I can talk more about that. But in order for this to be something that workers really benefit from, workers really need a voice in this. They need to be able to help shape this. We need to have guardrails to make sure workers actually are protected for some of the worst. And when there are productivity gains, it's not inevitable that workers necessarily share meaningfully in those benefits. So I think there's a lot of really big questions ahead. But I think there's huge potential there that is also very exciting.
I'm curious. I mean, we saw an example, like a big example last year with the writer's strike and actors, and one of the big wins that they got in their contract was trying to kind of maintain some control when it comes to how employers are using AI. But I wonder, do you see, that seems like a workplace to workplace sort of battle. Is there a role for policymakers to do something more far-reaching?
Yeah, so I just published an in-depth case study on what the Hollywood writers achieved, so I highly recommend reading it. It's long but readable. A lot of personal stories from some of the Hollywood writers on what exactly they went through and what they achieved. I think that case is super important because one of the most important things is it punctures the inevitability framing that often comes to technology. There's this assumption, this technology is coming for us, there's nothing we can do to stop it. We either need universal basic income or we all need to retrain. And I think the Hollywood writers showed that with solidarity, with worker power, with the opportunity for workers to come together and actually negotiate, they were able to secure amazing protections. Not only protections of their jobs, but to the extent AI is used, the writers themselves were going to benefit. So the contract is incredible, but the point of that is that it's not inevitable that this technology is just going to come and take these jobs that were dream jobs for these Hollywood writers. They were able to through worker power, have really important guardrails, and importantly, AI is allowed to be used. They didn't try to stop the technology. They were just trying to shape the way that they would benefit and avoid the harms. So I think one of the takeaways I have from this is we really need to make sure workers have some voice in this. And unfortunately, the bad news story is that when I looked at the sectors that are the most exposed to AI, those have the lowest union density across the entire economy. So take finance, 1% union density, and it's one of the sectors moving fastest. That's just one of many examples. So we have this really big imbalance where we're going to see the greatest change, we actually have the lowest forms of worker representation and voice. So I think there's a really important part for policymakers. I mean, we really need labor law reform to allow workers to be able to organize. We can't do things like sectoral bargaining that they're able to do in Europe. things that really give workers more a seat at the table with employers because of the way our labor laws are structured. So I think one of the most important actionable items is we really need labor law reform to enable workers to be able to shape this technology.
Okay. Ji-sung, let's talk again about worker safety, heat regulations. There are not a lot of regulations trying to address worker safety and heat illness and injury. California has got something going on. The federal government has said a few years ago that they are going to, that OSHA is going to put out a rule addressing heat safety in workers, but that's sort of still in the incubation phase. And I think some people might look around and say, like, well, people are like fainting on the job. Like, what gives? What's taking so long? Yeah. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I chuckled a little bit earlier when you said that the stereotype is of negative sociologists. I thought that was just economists. But I'm glad I'm in good company. Not to be the stereotypical economist here, though, but I do think that, look, regulating the workplace is complicated. We learned that in COVID. We've learned that in many instances. This isn't to say that, I mean, even my own research suggests that the effects of heat on workplace safety are very significant. But I'm actually not sure what exactly needs to be done about it because particularly around things like mandating certain practices in the workplace, given the diversity of forms of work, of industries, of occupations, and the rapidity of the change in these work settings, I think it's just always challenging to figure out what's the balance between prescriptive mandates versus letting the market figure it out. But I do agree in general with this idea that, especially given the forces of technological change and climate change that are squeezing the welfare of workers, making sure that there is a balanced representation in terms of the decision making, that seems important. But I didn't mean to sidestep your question, but I do think, when it kind of getting back to my earlier point about adaptation, some things are pretty obvious, but I don't think in the context of work it's necessarily obvious what we need to do to protect workers.
Well, let me give you a follow-up question that you can give you if you want to take off your negative economist hat. That's totally up to you.
It's just fused onto my head.
Because you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act as like a big achievement in terms of like the government and lawmakers saying like we're going to throw all this money at trying to address climate change. And one of the things I wonder about that is like, so as the government, as these policies roll out, is there an opportunity there to address some of the issues that workers are facing right now?
Yes, can I take a step back in an attempt to take this hat off? Just a very broad point about climate policy, and this is one of the points that I try to make in the book, which is, I think much of the public and probably many of us have a sense of climate change as this sort of impending planetary catastrophe, and there's good evidence to suggest that that's probably an accurate perception of the problem, but I do think it's worth supplementing our mental heuristics of, we can think of climate change as an impending planetary catastrophe and acting on it as a form of insurance against that. But we can also think about it as a sort of slow-burning crisis that affects different populations differentially, and that there are many things we can do to protect against that. So that's just a general point, but to answer your question, I think there are really good reasons for hope in the climate space, despite the fact that the more evidence, the more research we do, the more damaging it appears that even incremental warming is for the economy. We've actually already made a lot of progress, right? Warming projections for the world as a whole just 10, 15 years ago had us on pace to see warming of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of century. That's a lot. Now the best estimates are that we're on pace for somewhere between 1.8 and 3 degrees Celsius. Now the uncertainty bands around those ranges are large, and that's still a lot of warming, but progress is progress, and so I think that's worth underscoring. In terms of the IRA, we're seeing a rapid rise in EV-related jobs in this country. The cost of wind and solar have plummeted over the last decade, so these are all positive signals. But because we're this panel is largely about workers. I am concerned about what kinds of protections are in place currently for the workers who have been the so-called brown sector workers, right? The workers who have been manning the sort of carbon-intensive fossil fuel economy that we're now about to transition away from. The more successful we are at doing that, I think the more exposed many of these workers are. And if we've learned anything from labor market dislocations of the past, again, better to be proactive about putting safeguards in place. So I think that's an area that, while there's a lot of reason for hope in terms of the rise of green jobs, also want to make sure we're protecting the workers who are exposed to the reduction in labor demand that comes from our transition away from brown jobs.
So we have about 10 minutes before we get to questions, and this go around, maybe we'll think about this as a sort of the politics and policy round of questions. And whoever wants to go first can go first, but this being an election year, I think it's worth reflecting on, like, okay, we're gonna have 4 years of Biden. What is one policy change that's happened during the Biden administration that you feel like it has had like the most impact? And it could be a good impact, it could be a bad impact. But is there one policy that just kind of stands out as like, that was a big change?
I mean, this is sort of reactive, I think, but I know at the end of the Trump administration, one of the things that was really concerning to me as a researcher in my area was how much policy level and systemic pushback there was to thinking about these issues of racial inequality in the workplace, and the fact that policymakers were mandating requirements around what people could and could not say in trainings, in regular work settings, and so forth. That's not, to put it mildly, that is not good, right? And to be in a place where, like I said, there are such measurable disparities in our workplaces between black workers and other workers. Again, when it comes to wages, when it comes to representation in leadership, when it comes to opportunity for mobility, not to be able to even name and identify those pretty much just guarantees that those disparities are going to continue. So this is why I say it was a reactive policy, because it was reversing that trend in the previous administration. But I think it's really important to be able to continue to, one, collect data, two, continue to identify that these disparities are present and that they are things that we want to understand and to try to move away from, right? Just to give, by way of example, in the third section of gray areas, I talk about this move to advancement and how much advancement relies on relationships, and how we have this kind of imaginary conceptualization in our workplaces that the person who does the best job is the person who gets promoted, or the person who brings in the most money is the person who gets promoted. A lot of times that is not what happens, right? In many cases, the processes for advancement are very opaque, they are not very transparent, and in many cases it is driven by relationships that people have with people who are in supervisory roles, who are willing to offer them formal or informal guidance on how to move into leadership jobs. And what I learned in researching industry after industry is that there is no industry where black workers are represented at parity to their presence in the population. That is whether we're looking at healthcare, finance, government, academia. My field is not exempt. Every field that you look at, you will find this disparity present. So for that to be the case, and for that to have been the case for so long, and for there to be government policy that suggests that not only can you not try to erase those disparities, but that you can't even identify that those disparities are present, and you can't use basic social science language to identify that those are in place, really does not bode well for a multiracial democracy in a country that is only going to become more racially diverse in the future. So all that is just to say that I appreciate, even though it is a mostly reactive move, I appreciate the effort to try to untie researchers and workers' hands to give people the opportunity to try to continue identifying and addressing these issues.
Quickly, I would say most impactful in terms of biggest investment in workers is infrastructure bill, and I say biggest missed opportunity as an investment in workers is Build Back Better, the fact that we didn't pass any of the CARE investments.
I mean, at the risk of beating a dead horse, the IRA was the biggest thing in climate policy in decades, and that's a big win, so I think it's worth celebrating. I think of it as a big down payment on a multi-decadal mortgage. We still have a lot of payments left. And also just the return to some semblance of evidence-based policy in the world of climate change. Not to be too tongue-in-cheek, but the interagency working group on the social cost of carbon that was promptly disbanded was put back together, and that's been very influential in shaping our understanding of the magnitude of the climate problem, and other governments follow the U.S.'s lead on that issue. So yeah, I see those as two wins.
And this is sort of related to, thinking about like this being an election year. We don't really know what's on the other side of 2024. Who's going to be president in 2025? Who's going to be in Congress? Even with that uncertainty, are there policies in each of your areas where you're like, there may be a path forward for this. There may be a path forward for a policy change that maybe lawmakers on both sides of the aisle can agree on, and that would really make a difference?
I feel like those are two questions in one, right? Because there's the question of what policies would make a difference, and could we reasonably expect lawmakers to agree on passing those policies? So it's easier for me to answer the first, and that goes back to many of the policies that I mentioned before. There's evidence and data suggesting that a 4-day work week really can make a tangible, measurable difference and improvement in many workers' lives. There is data that also suggests that having some predictability when it comes to scheduling really matters a lot. There is data that shows that being able to unplug from your job and have a finite stop time really is significant. There is data that also documents that non-compete clauses are a big problem for workers and for their ability to experience economic stability. I already talked about paid leave and sick leave. I don't want to get back up on my high horse about that. But again, it's just so basic, and there's so much evidence to show how much these things really matter and how much of a difference they could make.
And do you think of these as things that, like, regardless of who's in the White House or who's in Congress, like, these are things that companies could do? And
some of them, some of them, yeah. And we do see some evidence in some places of companies moving in these directions. The problem that I see there is that we also have what some economists refer to as this fissured workplace in many cases. And what that means is that we have certain companies where they are able to hire high salaried, in many cases, workers. They're able to offer a lot of benefits. They provide these great jobs that include things like sick leave and schedule predictability and all that, and it's fantastic. But because our economy is often so fragmented, what that means is that many companies rely on companies that they contract out to for lower wage work. So for example, I work at the university, like I said. My job as a faculty member is actually a really good one. I have a lot of flexibility, I have a lot of autonomy, there's a lot of control over my schedule and so forth. But the people who clean my office in the evening, the people who serve food in the dining halls and in the student centers, those aren't people who are actually employees of the universities. Those are people who are contracted through the university to work to do these types of jobs, and they don't get the same benefits. They don't have the same opportunities. And many of those dynamics are replicated throughout our economy. So I don't think that, I think it's great for companies that do provide those benefits to workers, and I salute them, and I think that's really important, but I think that it takes a broader federal policy that's really invested in supporting workers across the board to make sure that every worker has access to these types of baseline benefits, and that it's not just subjected to being able to spend 6 years in a PhD program and then land a tenure track job, right? I mean, I'm very appreciative of these aspects of my job, but they shouldn't be things that it requires that to go through. These are things that are basic, and they should be available to everybody, and I think that's where federal policy becomes really important.
Jisung, Molly, do you have a thought about like what would have impact and what could be doable in an uncertain future?
Yes, I'm always humbled when I talk to my friends who actually work in policy, how incredibly poor my intuition around politics is, so I'll try to stay in my lane. But just to maybe one idea that's consistent with the evidence is I do think there is a lot of research now suggesting that there are a lot of red states that are poised to experience a great deal of damage from climate change. And so to the extent that there's an important coordinating role that the federal government can and should play in terms of the adaptation response to these shocks that are, again, baked into the system over the next 3 or 4 decades, there may be an opportunity there. Maybe it comes down to framing it as not as climate change, but extreme weather or what have you. That's sort of beyond my pay grade. But again, I'm sometimes baffled by, if you look at a map of some of the areas of the country that are most likely to be hit hardest by climate change, it's interesting how they fall in terms of political affiliation. I'll just leave it at that.
Molly.
Yeah, so I think on this issue of AI and the workforce, there's actually like very broad bipartisan interest in this topic. When I've talked to Hill staffers, they say when their members of Congress go to their home districts, this is the topic related to AI that they're most interested in. But as Jisung was saying, this actually is an issue that defies easy legislative solutions. It's really hard to regulate at a workplace setting what's good automation, what's bad. You know, it's very difficult to come up with something that's really going to be a magic bullet on this front. I think where there's probably the most bipartisan support is on something around workforce training or retraining or something in that bucket, which is meaningful because really our system is very inadequate for this challenge. I think things that are a little bit more ambitious that would get more into the heart of, can we make sure workers have a voice in this? Can they shape this? Can we sort of think about ways that workers share in the productivity gains? I think those kinds of solutions are going to fall more in partisan lines, and I'm much less optimistic that anything in the near term will pass, but we will keep trying. We will do our best, and maybe, you never know, maybe this topic, since it's so relevant to the American population, will unite left and right. Who knows?
I guess now we do questions. Who has a question? You want to raise your hand?
Sorry, I can get up too. Thank you for in terms of, it's really interesting to hear, again, these are three big forces like impacting the future of the economy. And one, I appreciate it, all of you touched on unions and collective bargaining and that power. But the one other tool that I feel like inevitably we will need across all three of these areas to really make a dent is adequate enforcement. And that is something that, whether it's OFCCP or EEOC or Wage and Hour, EPA, and that is an issue that is very partisan. And so just curious from each of your perspectives to be able to do adequate oversight, whether it's on AI, et cetera, what would adequate enforcement dollars do to ensure that these forces impact workers positively in each of your areas?
Well, at least when it comes to racial inequality in workplaces, I mean, we know that for a long time there has been significant and consistent underfunding of agencies that are tasked with that type of oversight. The EEOC's budget has declined significantly over years. They are nowhere near at pace with the way that our economy and the labor force has grown. So I do think that adequately funding that agency, I mean, the agency is there to address some of the things that I've talked about. I think adequately funding it could go a long way in addressing some of the issues that I've talked about, at least.
Yeah, I think when I mentioned the sort of pre-generative AI set of concerns around the quality of work, those issues are still salient today. Those have not gone away just because ChatGPT has kind of caught our attention on livelihood risk. So I think in terms of enforcement, there's all sorts of important ways to make sure that workers' safety, for instance, like at a Amazon warehouse, for instance, I mean, there's a lot of enforcement that has to go in there. Some of this technology is being used in ways that undermine rights and actually increase injuries. And so I think enforcement at this stage would probably be most important with some of these job quality concerns and sort of labor concerns. A little less clear to me how immediately it's related to some of the livelihood risks inherent in this new technology, in part because we don't have any regulations about it. But I think in the future it would, of course, be very salient.
Sorry. My mistake. I mean, echoing everything that was said, enforcement in the workplace safety context, I mean, there's great evidence to suggest that randomized safety inspections improve safety at little to no economic cost to the firms that are inspected. There's also evidence in the environmental protection space that there's strategic location of monitors or air pollution monitors to try to sidestep regulation. So absolutely, better enforcement would allow us to tighten the screws on the policies that are already in place. Yeah.
Great. Anybody else got a question?
Thank you. I was just wondering, so I know the focus, we've talked a lot about workforce development in relation to AI and just kind of turning it to the other side of that. I was wondering what have you seen in terms of antitrust around AI and consolidation in the industry? And then sort of where do you think we can go with that or to prevent that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on a huge issue. I think the set of concerns around AI are not limited to workforce, so I just want to put that out there. I mean, my colleagues at Brookings were worried about national security, disinformation, you name it. We sometimes argue whose issue is more scary. I think national security wins the day. But antitrust is a huge issue. I mean, this issue of competition is so important. A lot of these companies are galloping forward because they have access to these huge data sets. And so there's a lot of concern about sort of consolidation in the industry and what this is going to mean for competition. This is not my personal area of expertise, so I don't have a sort of a cheat sheet for the best policies. But I was just recently at a talk with one of the top government enforcers on this, and I know this is an issue that's a huge concern. I think there's been a big push to more sort of like public interest AI and sort of investments in sort of public sector AI, and can there be sort of a competing center of gravity on this, which I think is really an important area of exploration. When you hear about the sort of costs that some of these tech leaders are suggesting are needed to mobilize in order to get the compute, in order to keep these this technology advancing, it's pretty mind-boggling. So I think there's just unbelievably huge concerns around competition that arise in this. And I think separately, there's also just some big concerns around inequality. I mean, when you see who are the really going to be reaping the true riches of this, I read an Economist article recently that laid out, it's not even just the tech companies, it's also cloud computing, it's the semiconductors, it's NVIDIA. I mean, there's just a handful of these tech companies that are really, really, really benefiting from this, and there's huge concerns about inequality and sort of their increasing power, but also concentration.
Just to add one data point and to channel my UPenn colleague, Ioana Marinescu, who's worked on this a lot, consolidation is not only in terms of product market monopoly, right? Monopoly is when you have only one seller of a good, but also in terms of potential labor market monopsony, right? Consolidation in terms of the buyers of labor, right? The employer side of things. So just worth bearing that in mind.
On this issue of racial inequality, we've had many social movements to try to deal with the issue over the last, literally 100 years, and we really haven't made any really sufficient progress. I mean, the response to the civil rights movement was mass incarceration. The response to the various fights over voter rights has now been restrictions on voter rights. So the question is racism an inherent part of capitalism, and can we solve it within the capitalist system, or do we need to think to a more systemic change of the whole big picture?
Yeah, I mean, there are different schools of thought on that, right? And I don't know that that's a question that can completely be answered by the data that we have present. Certainly there are people who will argue that that systemic racial inequality is endemic to capitalism and that you cannot eradicate one without the other. I don't know that I feel like there's necessarily data that conclusively proves that, though. I will say that I think when we take the historic long view, what we do see is some of what you've described, that for every social movement that has advanced some progress in the US, we've also seen backlash, right? And that progress is not necessarily something that's occurred in a linear, straightforward fashion. But we also have seen a number of pretty significant failures at a policy level that could have been opportunities where we could have addressed racial inequality more forcefully and more significantly over the long term, and policy choices were made not to do that, right? So yeah, I don't know that that necessarily means that there isn't room for racial equity under a capitalist system. I think that this becomes a bigger question of what types of policy choices are going to be made, what the movements look like, and what the population looks like that's driving for these. And one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is that we're entering a place where demographically the US is going to look very different than it has at any other point in its history, right? We're moving towards a much more racially diverse society that kind of demographic train is not stopping, that does have implications for how future generations are thinking about and understanding the world and their place in it that I think we don't necessarily completely understand for what that means in terms of what racial inequality looks like in the next 20, 30, 50 years. So I don't know if I'm giving you a satisfactory answer, but I don't think that there's necessarily data that conclusively argues that we can or cannot have a capitalist structure without racial inequality present.
Jasmine, my question's for you, and I'm the least knowledgeable about climate, but so basically, the biggest asshole I went to college with is running for labor commissioner in North Carolina, and because I'm a petty bitch, I have focused on
Not
helping
to be specific
defeat him.
or anything.
I know, but like, what struck me is he is running on defeating the OSHA heat standards, which don't exist yet. So clearly, like, and this guy's not got two brain cells to rub together to come up with this on his own. And it's actually a trend among labor commissioner candidates in the states like North Carolina that you mentioned that are most going to be affected. So clearly, like, business has mobilized to fund these campaigns. Do you have any thoughts on what to, like the reg doesn't even exist and they're already this mobilized?
Yeah. So
the lawyer can out-downer all y'all.
I did encourage people to be rowdy, and I still do.
Thanks, Adrian. I wish you're asking me to venture outside of my comfort zone in terms of political speculation. Oh, well, okay, that's an easier question. Thank you. Look, to be frank, it strikes me as large part symbolic what's going on with your friend in Texas. That's my personal opinion as a citizen. I don't have data on that. What is the business case to act on climate change? I think it is very strong. One obvious case is that if you believe that we're in a world where the citizenry of both the US and other countries has increasingly decided that acting on climate change is something that we are doing and will continue to do, then the train is leaving the station and you're either going to get on board or be left behind in terms of repurposing your operations to be conducive with a fossil fuel-free economy, right? I mean, whether we do it through a carbon tax or a cap and trade or subsidies or something else, the implicit price on carbon is going to rise and rise and rise. So if your business practices are carbon intensive and you remain as such, you will start to lose money if you haven't already. So that's just like a clear business case. The other business case to act on climate in terms of adapting your workforce or something else is just the fact that you may stand to lose money through the operational disruptions that climate change will continue to wreak on your various establishments. And so if you have not done the hard work of looking at your data and thinking about, okay, like which of my assets are exposed to various forms of climate risk, you probably should be doing that. And I know a lot of companies are. Again, as a labor economist, I do worry about what will be the priority in terms of what kinds of, who are we trying to protect in terms of the measures that are implemented? Are we protecting capital? Are we protecting labor? It's not always the same thing, right? And so that concerns me. But in terms of the overall business case to act on climate change, I would characterize that as overwhelming.
But also, I think you were specifically asking about the business case for heat safety regulation, right? Is there research to support a business case for heat safety regulation?
I was trying to sidestep that question, but basically, there's some evidence to suggest that what happened in California. So California was the first state to implement a mandatory heat safety rule. That was back in the Governor Schwarzenegger days.
That was outdoor workers. And they recently passed one for indoor workers, right?
They're in the process of. I wish I could share. So my colleagues, Patrick Baer at the World Bank and Nora Pankras at the Federal Reserve and I are currently working on research that tries to really disentangle, okay, what happened in terms of both the safety impacts of this legislation, but also, corporate profits, employment, just to get a holistic picture. That research is not ready yet, but we're actively asking that question, which is why I'm hesitant to give a definitive answer either way, just because I believe the evidence-based policy.
You and your colleagues are on the case.
Yes, thank you for, yeah.
Questions?
Oh, yeah.
Fellow nerds? Ah, yes.
Yeah, so I have a question that intersects with both Molly and Jisung. It seems like our demand for computing power is increasing quite rapidly with AI, with cloud computing. Crypto is back, which is also, computer intensive. But how much of an impact does that have in terms of like climate? How much of a climate impact does that have? Is the question.
I appreciate the question. I wish I had the specific numbers. I don't off the top of my head. The way one would think about that is to think about, okay, what is the share of emissions that come from electricity generation, and how carbon intensive is the electricity grid from which the energy that is powering these cloud computing operations is coming. That's going to vary by state, that's going to vary by country, but I don't have the numbers off the top of my head.
I would just say that the estimates I've read is that the energy consumption potential is enormous. I was also reading something this week that even the cooling of the data centers is going to cause huge problems. So I'm shocked that we're not having more of a conversation about this. There's so much excitement about the technology and also fear about jobs, but yet this environmental, energy, climate conversation feels a little bit not happening. I don't exactly know why that is, but it seems like it's a huge problem. In addition to sort of the other challenges of cost and compute, I think the environmental impacts.
Add one point to that, and not to be the classic economist here, but if we were in a world where we had an implicit or explicit price on carbon, you wouldn't have to ask that question. Does that make sense? Because that would have been taken care of.
Let's see, do we have time for another question?
Does the hand over here still live?
Just this will be an easy one. So I'm wondering about your views on the role of tariffs in helping us meet our climate goals, in protecting workers across industries. I'm thinking of a specific example of the tariffs on electric vehicles from China, but would also be interested in just hearing views more broadly.
Both mics?
I think that's a wonderful question. To be frank, I am not versed in the updated literature on this. I know there is a very active academic debate about this. The stylized economist answer to tariffs has always been, no, bad, find better ways. I think there is increasingly a strong support among my colleagues for this idea of a border carbon adjustment mechanism, which would essentially force other countries that are not as active on climate policy to pay the costs associated with that in order to do international business. But yeah, I hesitate to comment about the appropriateness of the EV tariffs, just because I don't know enough about that literature.
My only reflection is when it comes to generative AI, I think what's sort of surprising in our conversations is manufacturing and blue-collar work is actually really underexposed to generative AI. So if we're thinking about this technology that's just emerging, it really doesn't have very much impact unless the technology advances so much that it really impacts robotics. Right now it's not there. It's service sector. It's very much jobs that are not they're not traded with other countries. They're not exportable. This is really work, think like legal, STEM, clerical work, creative work in this country. So tariffs really wouldn't be a solution there. But I just wanted to, I hadn't actually said that. I think when we think about technology, our national psyche is still very much reeling from the last impacts of technology, which was very much the heartland. It was manufacturing work. We have big political ramifications of that. And so I think we still think of that, and actually we need to update our mental model of who are the types of workers that are going to be impacted. It's women. Our data and everyone's data is saying the same thing. The highest exposure to the technology is women, which could be benefit. That could be benefit or negative, but the automation risk is more concentrated on women as well. And what's interesting about that, the reason is that women now outpace men in getting college degrees. So what I find so striking is that the solution, in a way, women have finally achieved this outcome, which is that they're finally catching up with men in these professional realms, and now this technology is coming to exactly what they've just achieved. But really what we need to update our priors, it's really not, which isn't to say there aren't issues with manufacturing, but my impression is manufacturing work is going up right now for all the reasons of all the investments. It's really some of this other work that's more female dominated, that's pink collar or white collar that's impacted.
Yeah, it's a complicated question to answer for the type of research that I do, for the same reason that you said. Most of the workers that I focus on are in service industry jobs, where the products that they're creating are emotions or an experience or something like that. Now, with that said, though, I think there's room to think about how tariffs could potentially have an impact on exacerbating racial inequality in workplaces writ large, depending on what we are talking about being taxed and where that lands and what impacts that has on which segments of the economy, right? I focus on black professional workers, but they actually are a relatively small number of those who are in professional jobs. Most black workers are not employed in professional positions. So if we're talking about where black workers mostly are situated and concentrated, it's in the southeast or southern regions of the United States. It's often in lower wage service jobs or to somewhat of a lesser degree in the types of manufacturing jobs that you were just talking about, where tariffs could potentially have an outsized impact on their work, depending on how businesses and companies respond to the products that are actually being taxed and what that means for labor.
And if I can, because I'm coincidentally doing an upcoming episode about tariffs on this question, and on these like tariffs on like EVs, solar panels, it seems like, okay, well, the Biden administration is saying like this is part of our plan to try and have the U.S. own the green energy future. But having interviewed a couple of economists about this, and maybe this is what the standard answer is, they've said like, well, this is probably a trade-off, right? Like, do you want to speed the clean energy future and get, clean vehicles into as many people as possible? Okay, you could do that, but if you impose tariffs, that means you are probably closing off certain like vehicles that people could start buying, cheap Chinese electric cars, and that may delay the clean energy future. But maybe that translates into jobs, and it sounds like there's actually, you're saying, a robust debate on like whether this is a good idea or not.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there, I think. Yeah? Yeah. Well, thank you all again for coming. That is it. Please enjoy the what?
Thank you all so much for coming. We will continue to have the room over there open. You can tell that I'm not used to speaking in a mic. Apologies for how loud it is. We really appreciate all of you for joining us, for your wonderful questions. Hopefully you all follow up to me whenever I email you. Thanks so much.